Good afternoon. I welcome you to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation. Press Center. Another briefing. We have Russian and foreign correspondents with us. We start with the schedule of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia. On June 16th, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is scheduled to meet with the Regional Director of the World Health Organization's Regional Office for Europe, Hans Kluge. He is in Russia on a working visit at the invitation of the Ministry of Health of the Russian Federation. The agenda of the upcoming negotiations includes topical aspects of cooperation between Russia and its regional bureau, prospects for the development of this cooperation in the CIS space, and special attention is expected to be paid to the reform of the World Health Organization in the context of the current challenges facing global health. On June 17th, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Indonesia will visit Moscow. During the talks with his Russian counterpart, it is planned to exchange views on a wide range of issues on the bilateral agenda, including the expansion of political contacts, including at the highest level of security ties, as well as trade, economic and humanitarian spheres. Naturally, the broad agenda will also be touched upon, as well as the improvement of the contractual and legal framework of relations. It is supposed to consider the main international and regional problems. We will publish additional materials on this subject on the website of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and on the official accounts of the Russian Foreign Ministry on social networks. Well, and that event, which is naturally coming, is international, relevant. We are talking about the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. In the 28th, it will take place, as you know, in St. Petersburg from the 18th to the 21st of June. And of course, the event will traditionally take place on the territory of the Expoforu Convention and Exhibition Center. The St. Petersburg International Economic Forum has a reputation as an authoritative international platform for dialogue between representatives of business, government agencies, the scientific community, and expert circles, devoted to issues of the world economy, sustainable development, and technological transformations. Heads of state, heads of international organizations, representatives of leading corporations, and of course civil society, and the media are expected to participate. The central theme of the forum will be the search for common guidelines for the formation of sustainable development. In the conditions of global turbulence, more than 150 events are planned as part of the business program. They cover areas such as the digital economy, environmental sustainability, healthcare, international cooperation, technological innovation, and regional development. There is a steady interest in the forum from the international community. In the 23rd year, let me remind you, more than 17,000 people from 130 countries took part in it. In the 24th, there are more than almost 22,000 participants from 139 countries of the world. According to the results of the last forum, 1,073 agreements were signed for a total amount of about 6.5 trillion rubles. This indicates a high level of trust and business activity. The forum has been held under the patronage of the President of the Russian Federation since 2000. The organizers are the Roscongress Foundation with the support of relevant ministries, departments, including the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Economic Development of the Russian Federation. It seems to me that this is a well-known fact. The St. Petersburg Forum remains the most important instrument of constructive international cooperation, aimed at developing a multipolar world, strengthening economic stability, and finding balanced solutions in the face of modern challenges. A number of representatives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of our country will take part in specialized sessions. Panel sessions of the forum on topics related to changes in the global economy and trade, the development of integration processes, regional cooperation, challenges in the field of energy, food, technological development, as well as a number of country business dialogues, Briggs and STRU business forums. Among them is the formation of a multipolar economy and the role of Russia's place in Eurasia, international trade, climate regulation, a solution for Briggs, STRU, EU and APEC without barriers, the Yalta-Potsdam system of international relations, lessons from the past or memories of the future, as well as a number of country business dialogues, Briggs and STRU business forums. And of course, according to tradition, the Press Information Department also actively participates in the forum. This year, 2 discussion panel sessions of the post-truth world are being held. The formation of a fairly stable world order through the strengthening of the common values of the countries of the world majority. It will take place on the 19th of June, and the fight against fakes, the formation of a global infrastructure, and the consolidation of efforts. It will take place on the 20th of June. We invite everyone, And a small announcement. Our next briefing will take place on the sidelines of the St. Petersburg Forum, also according to tradition. Let's move on to the current international agenda. The situation around Ukraine. More than enough has already been said about Russia's implementation of the agreements reached in Istanbul, but at the same time, there are additional issues. I would like to answer them comprehensively. After the second round of direct Russian-Ukrainian talks in Istanbul on June 2nd, Russia promptly started implementing the humanitarian package of agreements reached there. On the 6th of June, a list of 640 wounded and seriously ill, as well as soldiers under the age of 25, who are subject to exchange, was sent to Kiev. The exchange process began on June 9th, when the first group of young servicemen was returned to us at the Belarusian-Ukrainian border. The second stage of the exchange took place yesterday, the 10th of June. Russian fighters are provided with the necessary psychological and medical assistance. Their comments, I think, are happy, joyful, that they have returned home, that the country is doing everything to get them out of there. I think you've seen their comments too. As part of the repatriation of 6,000 bodies of the fallen soldiers of the armed forces of Ukraine, Russia delivered them to the agreed area of the Belarusian-Ukrainian border on June 7th, the first one. I can't pronounce this word party after all. We are talking about the people who died, but there is a terminology. 1,212 bodies were delivered. However, the Kiev regime, having shocked, it seems to me, everyone, refused to accept them. Russia is fully prepared to implement the agreements reached in Istanbul. We expect the same approach from the Ukrainian side. But this is not the first and not the only one. Although it is really the most powerful evidence of this most inhuman kind of essence of the Kiev regime, confirmation of its rebirth into a tourist organization. The Kiev regime has continued to strike at the civilian population and the civilian infrastructure of the Russian regions over the past week. Let me remind you, because they still call the people living there for some reason, but they continue to call them their own. A man was injured in the Belgorod region on the 2nd of June in the village of Atmish as a result of dropping an explosive device from a drone on the territory of a private house. Near the village of Dubraya, a drone attacked a moving gazelle, and 2 men were injured. June 3rd, 4 civilians were injured, among them an 18-year-old young man, in whose hands an object picked up by him on the street, which looked like a lighter, exploded. The 5th-7th of June in Belgorod, in Volchaya Alexandrovka, in Novaya Tavolzonka. As a result of drone strikes, 13 civilians were injured. On the 9th of June, an 8-year-old boy was injured from the wreckage of a drone crash in Belgorod. In the Kursk region, on the 2nd of June, targeted strikes were inflicted on a school and a house of culture. In the village of Narodny, June 3rd, a Ukrainian drone attacked the village of Kravyakovka in the Luzhkovsky district. A 31-year-old man was killed. On the night of the 3rd to the 4th of June, a Ukrainian drone shelled the city of Rilsk. A 66-year-old woman was injured. A repeated enemy strike on this locality on the 5th of June, already with the use of a multiple rocket launcher system, claimed the lives of 2 women. 5 other people were injured. One of the victims had 3 minor children. On the 6th-7th of June, 5 citizens, including a 65-year-old man, were injured in the villages of Martinovka, Korish, Belovsky, Koronevsky district as a result of drone attacks by ISU drones. June 8th, the enemy attacked a substation for 110 kilowatts of Rilsk. There, an enemy drone attacked the Assumption Cathedral. According to the head of the Porechensky Village Council, Elena Zhadnova, after the occupation of the Afu village of Russian Porekhnaya in the Kursk region, all the remaining residents died. According to her, since the beginning of the invasion, 92 people remained in the Tushinsky district. They are mostly elderly people. Only 10 managed to get out by the time of his release in March of the 25th. Out of 82 people, 48 were killed, 34 were missing. In the Bryansk region, the 5th of June, in the village of Demyanki, the enemy hit an agricultural enterprise. 3 workers were injured. 1 civilian was wounded in the DPIE on June 3rd. On the 7th of June, as a result of the release of 20 units of various ammunition to the opponents, 2 civilians were injured, including a teenager born in 2009 year. In the LPR on the 3rd of June, the Ukranazis dropped drone ammunition directly on people. What were they doing, these people? They were just standing at a store in the village of Svatova. 2 civilians were injured. A civilian passenger car was attacked on the Starobel to Svatova highway. The driver was injured. In the Zaporozhye region, on the 5th of June, as a result of an enemy attack, a woman was injured 1948th year of birth. In the settlement of Alyosha Proletarka, this is the Kherson region, 3 civilians were wounded on the 4th-5th of June. On the 8th of June, radon shelling by the AFU of the residential sector led to the wounding of a man born 1969th year. But there will be punishment for all of this. Russian courts continue to investigate military and other crimes of Ukrainian neo-Nazis, mercenaries, and sentencing continues. The militants of the Azovka National Battalion, I remind you, are recognized as a terrorist organization, and activity on the territory of Russia is prohibited. Sniper Ruslan Orlov and orderly Artem Novikov were sentenced to imprisonment for 26 and 24 years, respectively, for the murder of civilians in the DPI. 4 more Ukrainian militants, Rifleman Igor Drabeda and Vladimir Golodnyak, machine gunners Evgeny Gora and Vladimir Samarydchenko, received sentences for the armed blocking of the village of Olgovka in the Kursk region. Each is assigned 15 years of imprisonment. The grenade launcher of the armed forces of Ukraine, Sergei Stuka, for the shelling of civilians of the village of Pogrebki, Kursk region. He received 16 years in prison, 23.5 years with serving in a penal colony of a strict regime for the murder of a civilian in Mariupol, was appointed to the Azov Danilo Ovcharenko. Well, and about those who are behind it all, who sponsor it all financially. On June 4th, the 28th meeting of the contact group on, as they call themselves, defense assistance to Ukraine, took place in Brussels. This is the same Rammstein format. For the first time, it was held without any, even virtual presence of us representatives, chaired by the Minister of Defense of the FERG of Britain. The cynical congratulations of the Kiev regime on the attacks on the Russian military airfields of strategic aviation directly testify to the charge of those present for the escalation. As the name of the impressive STRU operation was said there. Well, against this background, Zelensky, who joined this meeting on the Viks, started singing an old song about the need for early supplies of air defense systems, increased Western European investments in the Ukrainian military-industrial complex, in order to establish joint production of various types of weapons, in particular drones. This, Zelensky, is not an investment in the Ukrainian military-industrial complex. This is an investment in the deaths of Ukrainian citizens, whose corpses Zelensky does not want to take back. However, apparently, Zelensky could not convince his sponsors. The Allies did not fork out for the ever-growing appetites of the Kiev regime, preferring to report on their own so-called achievements in financing military spending, and this very terrorist activity of the Kiev regime. Britain intends, as part of the previously announced package of £4.5 billion, to allocate £350 million for the needs of the armed forces of Ukraine, for a tenfold increase in the number of delivered drones, from 10 to 100,000 units in the 25th year. What London has always said about human rights. Have you probably forgotten your old songs? Since the beginning of the year, London has shipped 140,000 art shells to the Kiev regime for the purpose of increasing the training of ISU militants under the Interflex program. £250 million have been reserved in the 25th year. Germany confirmed the allocation of a tranche of assistance to the Kiev regime in the amount of €5 billion, including financing the production of long-range weapons, the transfer of air defense systems, ammunition. Berlin will continue to collectively raise funds for the provision of air defense systems to the armed forces of Ukraine as part of the initiative, which is intended to make permanent. The Minister of Defense, the so-called Minister of Defense of Ukraine, Umerov, boasted about the plans of other allies to provide defense assistance to the Zelensky regime. Norway, according to him, is going to allocate $700 million for drones and transfer $50 million to the trust fund of the NATO security assistance mission, as it is said, and training for Ukraine in the German Wiesbaden. This is security. This is how they finance Ukraine. The Netherlands will give 400 million euros for a mine-fighting ship, boats, marine drones. Sweden deliberately, according to Amarov, allocated 400 million euros for a mine-fighting ship. Yes, sorry, this is the Netherlands. Sweden plans to allocate 440 million euros for the purchase of arsenals. Canada $45 million for drones, electronic security equipment, as they formulate it, and its solution. And Belgium, again according to Mirav, starting from the 29th year, will spend 1 billion euros to support Ukraine and intends to transfer a mine-fighting ship. Belgium, Italy, Turkey, Sweden, Estonia expressed a desire, according to him, to take part in the work of the so-called coalition of the Russian Federation, created at the previous meeting of the Rammstein group. The ideas of linking investment activity, investments in Rammstein turnover, with the EU's 150 billion direct height of the rearmament program were also voiced at the meeting. Here is a direct proof of what the NATO EU infrastructure is focused on. What does their thought revolve around? They are not interested in the life of their own population, economic development, solutions to problems that are on the agenda of both the European continent and the whole world. They are interested in the escalation of the conflict and the continued use of the Kiev regime and Ukraine for their own purposes. But what are these goals? A good question that needs to be addressed to them. In parallel, on the 4th of June, France announced the provision of financial guarantees to Ukraine for 1.5 billion euros for defense purchases from national companies and joint military production. On the 6th of June, the French defense minister announced that Renault would launch a car concert in Ukraine. But you probably think a car. Yes, no, drones. The Renault automotive market, what can I say, is losing. No refund loses. Well, we have retrained. Lisbon plans to allocate military assistance to the Kiev regime in the 25th year for approximately 225 million euros. Once again, all this testifies to the aggressive attitude of the Western European allies of the Kiev regime, their maniacal desire to escalate the conflict at any cost. But what about Ukraine? There is a violent mobilization going on there. The lack of human resources at the front forces the Kiev regime to seek new, more and more perverted forms of forced mobilization. From February to June, a second medical examination in Ukraine was forced to pass about 1.5 million conscripts, who previously had the status of limited fit. Is it any wonder that now more than 90% of them have lost their stitching firm mobilization? The Verkhovna Rada adopted in the first reading a bill on the possibility, direct quote, of voluntary mobilization of men over 60 years of age. And it is proposed to sign a contract for 1 year with the consent of the commander and the general staff, with a probationary period of 2 months and the possibility of termination of the contract. These Ukrobander activists now declare that the country has already come, well, meaning, of course, Ukraine, to the stage when not only men, but also women, as well as young people from the age of 18, should prepare for possible mobilization in Ukraine. In other words, this topic is beginning to be actively pumped. They note that at the moment there is no such need, however. The situation may change dramatically, and the entire adult population of Ukraine, without exception, I believe, should not be aware of the likelihood of mobilization and be prepared for it. June 9th, educational, so-called ombudsman of Ukraine Nadezhda Leshakov has recognized the fact of mass departure of high school students of Ukraine abroad. Her direct quote, "In the 10th-11th grades, one number of children begin to study, and quite another finishes. Moreover, girls also began to leave the country." She also, I mean the Educational Ombudsman of Ukraine, noted that this is facilitated by the statement of the authorities about plans to put 18-year-olds under the gun already in the coming autumn. These statements are made by officials of Ukraine itself. Jim Zelensky, for the sake of self-preservation in power, is ready for anything, including sacrificing school children now. I think they will send them to slaughter without the slightest hesitation. And now about how citizens in Ukraine are punished for disagreeing with the Kiev regime, which seeks to complicate people's lives as much as possible for the slightest deviation from the imposed installations. Look, on the 4th of June, the Verkhovna Rada approved a bill on criminalizing violations and circumvention of economic sanctions. What's so unusual about that? Yes, look, this very law. The bill establishes criminal liability, including direct, quote, for careless violation of sanctions. And not only under sanctions, but even by third parties. The penalty includes a fine, a huge fine. 425,000 is a start of up to 2 million hryvnias and imprisonment for up to 10 years, as well as possible additional punishment in the form of deprivation of the right to hold certain positions, conduct certain activities, for up to 15 years, and, of course, confiscation of property. But again, these are all separate facts from different spheres. But even they prove the urgency of special military operations to denazify, demilitarize Ukraine, and eliminate threats emanating from its territory. All of them, as the Russian leadership has repeatedly said, will be fulfilled. And now about the information and political support that the West provides to the Kiev regime. Sometimes we literally provide it, rendering them a disservice instead of helping. On the 29th of May, a publication entitled In the Best Traditions, of course, the Yellow Press, appeared in the Canadian edition of this Globe Mail. I'm going to say it now. Satellite data shed light on, as it is said in the Canadian press, the modern Russian GULAG. For whom do you think? That's right, the same, promoted by Ukrainian children. Well, it's just not even fake. This is something even more. This is some kind of disinformation company that has become part of the work of the traditional media. This horror describes fantastically how some non-governmental organizations, for Canadian money, reveal information in open sources about allegedly, direct quote, missing Ukrainian children. Social networks of social workers and children are monitored, satellite images are studied, artificial intelligence is used for this. In general, they work tirelessly, and all for what? The noble goal, as they said, is to return minors to Ukraine, and they are aware that we have now been given a list of those whom the Kiev regime is allegedly looking for. How much is there? 339 children. Before that, they said 20,000, and before that they mentioned some millions at all. In such a laborious way, according to the Canadian edition, it was allegedly possible, as they write, to free 129 people and mark 136 social facilities, in which Ukrainian children are allegedly located. Well, I think that just Goebbels would have applauded this Canadian edition standing up. Only one question, but why was it necessary to go such a difficult way? It's unclear. After all, we have repeatedly talked about the existence of a well-established mechanism for finding children, if they are missing, if there are questions, or there are any suspicions. If someone is looking for their child, it suggests that he may be in our country. It is enough to contact the Office of the Commissioner for Children's Rights under the President of Russia, Maria Zakharova. Representatives of the Children's Mosman will work out this application promptly. All contacts are there, all contacts are working. If the child is really in Russia, then there will be no obstacles to his reunification with relatives. Moreover, the authorized structures will provide all the necessary assistance, as they have repeatedly stated, and, Most importantly, they have repeatedly demonstrated. To date, 101 minors from 81 families have been reunited with their parents or relatives who live in Ukraine in other countries, and 22 children from 15 families returned to Russia from Ukraine. On the 2nd of June, during direct Russian-Ukrainian negotiations, I remind you, we raised this issue again and received a list from the Kiev regime. There were 339 names in it. None stolen, but due to various circumstances, lost contact with relatives. For each surname, for each name, for each child, there is a trial, verification, work. But there was no need to wait for direct negotiations. You just need to pick up the phone and call, or send an email, or write on social networks. To the Commissioner for Children's Rights of the Russian Federation, Maria Zakharova, mentioned in the highest Canadian publication. I have to call it a publication, but it's really just a real lampoon. Readers are told that in the children's youth patriotic camps of the Anarmia movement, which the authors call for some reason, you won't believe it, a modern GULAG, that's exactly what they call the GULAG. Again, as journalists write, Ukrainian children are allegedly forcibly assimilated, forbidden to speak, move, and almost forcibly detained. That's what needs to happen. Well, let's figure it out. First of all, participation in the ANARM is a purely voluntary matter. Have you ever seen, I don't know, children tied up with a rope who are forced to go somewhere, read poems, sing songs? Have you seen this under the auspices of the Anarmia? I never. Well, from Canada, of course, it is more visible, especially with the use of artificial intelligence via satellites. Oh, how we came in. Secondly, the child enters the Anarmia only with the consent of the legal representative. The appropriate papers should be issued. Thirdly, according to the charter of the Anarmia, the goal of the movement is, direct quote, the upbringing and formation of the younger generation, comprehensive personal development of children and adolescents, satisfaction of their individual needs for intellectual, moral, and physical improvement. How are these goals achieved? It's also written by developing responsibility, principles of collectivism, a system of moral attitudes of the individual based on the principles of justice, equality, unity, responsibility, love for people, respect and tolerance for them in the youth environment. End quote. Has anyone at Global read this? No, somewhere. They were given a satellite to control. They all know now. Where is there about some kind of erasure of the identity of the Ukrainian or some other? Where is the ban on speaking any language, in particular Ukrainian? Where is there about hatred of Ukrainians or other nationalities or ethnic groups or religious groups? There is not a word about Ukraine at all. The Canadian publication that published this slanderous, creepy Russophobic material, for some reason did not bother to inform readers that there is militarization and a real endocrinization of minors in Ukraine. It has been put on stream for many years. Children are taught from infancy not to love their neighbor, not to live in peace with their neighbors. Russians, and the Russian language are being imposed on us. They teach, direct quote, to cut Muscovites. That's what they formulated. To cut them with knives. To glorify the Nazi collaborators Bandera, Shukevich, and other Hitler's henchmen. A whole network of Nazi children's camps was openly deployed in the country. I mean Ukraine. After all, who acts as mentors there? Militants of terrorist organizations banned in Russia, right sector. Who gives the money? The state allocates money for all this outrage in Ukraine, including receiving it from abroad. When did it all start? Long before the special military operation. For the 15th year, the 17th year, the 18th, the 19th, the Western press of Daily Mail, NBC and others published publications on this topic that global colleagues do not read. And it's time after especially such shameful publications. Representatives of foreign media were shocked by the level of hatred, aggression, militarization of very young Ukrainians, who openly spoke about their hatred of Russia. In April, Zelensky's regime announced the creation of so-called resistance training centers. They will be open, according to him, in all regions of Ukraine. They will train saboteurs from civilians as instructors. As usual, of course, there will be militants of nationalist, neo-Nazi formations. And, of course, it is impossible not to see here, although the Globe and Mail turned out to quote the deputy head of the office of the President of Ukraine, Irina Vereshchuk. Here is the 23rd of May that she wrote, stated, "Whether there will be peace agreements, we have already quoted these words, or not. Russia, according to Vereshchuk, remains our enemy for decades, if not for centuries. It is she who can guarantee that it will be there in centuries. Our children," Vereshchuk said, "should prepare. They should know what war is." End quote. No, the Global Mail did not see this, but in vain. The Kiev regime follows its ideological inspirers, the German Nazis in everything. Children's paramilitary neo-Nazi camps in Ukraine are an analog of Hitlerjugend, and the centers of the so-called resistance are an analog of the Volkssturm territorial militia. Don't they know this in Canada, where there were so many who hid from the tribunals, from international legal persecution, being Nazis and collaborators? This very Volkssturm was created at the sunset of fascist Germany to attract to the fighting the uninvolved mobilization of the civilian population. However, those who follow their Hitlerite idols in Ukraine should not forget about their inglorious end. Let me remind you, then, 80 years ago, the possessed Führer committed suicide, fearing just retribution. The surviving Nazi leaders were brought before the Nuremberg tribunal. Many have been overtaken by justice in their own countries. Yes, many were warmed up. Well, I think that Canada is very well aware of this. Maybe Globe Mail will make material on this account instead of such fakes. Zelensky's junta is ready to sacrifice the future of Ukraine, that is, children and youth, for the sake of its own salvation, sacrificing its neo-Nazism to this. But neither the Canadian nor the British press will write about it. Although now, we see in Western countries, here and there is a desire to get to the truth. Why don't they write about it in Canada now? Yes, because they sponsor the Kiev regime. How can they see the truth? They need to develop and escalate the crisis. They need to take it all to a new level of confrontation. There's no time for the truth anymore. They absolutely do not care that children and young people are being physically and mentally crippled. Now about the activities of the EIA in connection with the situation around the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Since the 1st of September of the 22nd year, employees of the EIA Secretariat have been on a rotating basis at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant at the invitation of our country. The decision on their admission to this Russian nuclear facility was made by Russia, taking into account the regular rocket and artillery shelling of the station and its satellite city of Energodar by the armed forces of Ukraine, as well as attempts by Ukraine to storm the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. The purpose of this step was to force the Kiev regime to show greater restraint towards the station itself and its personnel. Experts of the agency's secretariat regularly make rounds of the station, record the consequences of the UPU strikes on the facility, interact with the management and staff of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Together with Russian specialists, they monitor the radiation situation, take part in the control of supervisory activities at the facility, in connection with the regular attempts to present the experts at the station as a kind of mission, allegedly sent there at the request of Ukraine. We have repeatedly stressed that we are talking about a group of experts of the Secretariat who are at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant on the basis of agreements between Russia and the leadership of the EIA. In the period from the 22nd to the 24th year, the rotation of the Secretary's staff from the agency at the facility was carried out through the line of contact. Their conduct has been repeatedly accompanied by provocations on the part of the Ukrainian armed forces. In these circumstances, it was decided to continue to carry out rotations exclusively through the territory of the Russian Federation. The successful holding of these events demonstrated that, despite the monstrous obstacles imposed by the Kiev regime, we are doing everything in our power to ensure the effective and safe presence of specialists of the M Secretariat. At the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, the experts of the Secretariat who were there had the opportunity to repeatedly observe the provocations of the Kiev regime against the station, in particular, during the series of strikes by the VSO on the training center of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant with the use of drones that took place on June 5. Under pressure from Western countries, the agency's leadership still does not dare to publicly name Ukraine as a guilty country for creating threats to the nuclear and nuclear security of the facility, even despite the fact that the agency's CEO Rafael Grossi himself witnessed the attacks of the APU during his visits to our station. For our part, we regularly bring information about the provocations of the Kiev regime against the Russian Zaporozhye nuclear power plant and its personnel to the attention of the EIA member states during the session of the agency's decision-making bodies, as well as through the preparation and dissemination of relevant information circulars. And here's another thing about the United Nations system at the Secretariat. During a press conference on May 27th, the official representative of the UN-Secretary General Tujarek noted another biased statement in the context of the Ukrainian crisis. Incompatible with the status of a high-ranking employee of the Secretariat, it turned out that Antonio Guterres, as if, well, this phrase was prescribed to him, condemns the allegedly large-scale Russian strikes on Ukraine on May 24-25, but is only concerned, as stated by Desharek, in connection with the raids of Ukrainian drones on Russian territory. The Secretary General predictably ignored it, but it was presented again to his representatives that Russia was only hitting the enterprises of the Ukrainian military-industrial complex with the use of high-precision weapons, and the Kiev regime deliberately aimed at the civilian population of our country. It is also significant that he presented the Russian strikes as almost an established fact, and the attacks of Ukrainian drones only as hypothetical. Well, how can this be? It's also impossible. It's just a shame to somehow allow yourself to say this to the representative of the Secretary of this United Nations, especially to attribute these words to the UN-Secretary General. We regard this statement, and I say it again, it was attributed to Antonio Guterres, as another proof of the bias and double standards of the UN leadership. The Secretary General and his wards, subordinates, those people who directly report to him, have long been shamelessly silencing the blatant violations of international civil law by the Kiev regime. Well, or at best, some parties or everyone in general are calling for restraint. Moreover, this line is carried out even in cases when all the facts unequivocally point to the responsibility of the armed forces of Ukraine. There is no sympathy, no empathy about any human rights or about the suffering of people. Unfortunately, they do not remember. There is no need to go far for examples. We have repeatedly called on Antonio Guterres and other high-ranking Kiev functionaries to condemn the terrorist attack on the Kursk region. In August of the 24th year, other documented high-profile crimes of the Bandera regime. However, representatives of the Secretariat consistently declined to comment on the merits. They repeated their calls for restraint, for independent investigations. And this can also happen, but then, probably, everyone needs to be nurtured as well. Everyone should be urged to be restrained, to find rounded formulations, to emphasize that they do not have data on the basis of which it is possible to draw unambiguous conclusions, and then how interesting it turns out, as if the eyepieces are configured only in one direction, and in the other a thorn in the eyes. From the same series, Dujarik's reaction to the questions of a Russian journalist at a press conference on June 3rd regarding the blowing up of bridges committed, of course, by Kiev regime terrorists in the Bryansk and Kursk regions. When the UN asked if Antonio Guterres wanted to condemn these atrocities, he got off with only an expression of sadness in connection with all the victims, with all the civilian casualties suffered during the Ukrainian conflict. Powerful. Can it always be like this? Or what? Or is it still visible from all sides? We need to decide. In contrast, Antonio Guterres, and other high-ranking staff of the UN Secretary-General willingly pick up and replicate the insinuations concocted at the bank and, of course, in Western capitals, aimed at discrediting our country. It is unfortunate that they do not rely on reliable sources of information and do not bother to double-check the invoice. With his statements, Antonio Guterres significantly exceeds his authority, grossly violating the ethical norms of an international official and Article 100 of the Charter of the United Nations. It instructs the employees of the executive bodies of the World Organization to adhere to an equidistant line. The Secretary-General undermines our trust in the political leadership of the Secretariat and actually deprives himself of the opportunity to act as an honest broker in the context of the Ukrainian crisis. We hope that the UN Secretary-General will find the strength to get out from under the influence of these very Western political adventurers, to take a verified neutral position on the Ukrainian story, and continue to prevent such ill-conceived and biased statements. Moreover, we remember and, by the way, respect and strongly support his fight against infodemia, so you don't have to become his sponsor. I mean the sponsor of the infodemia. Yes, and a few words about this aggressive mentality in the geopolitical dimension, in the international geopolitical dimension, the NATO countries. We drew attention to the information that appeared in the media about American plans to build another Pentagon megaproject in the Anchorage area, integrated combat training and testing center in the United States at the Elementarov-Richardson Air Base. Allegedly, the actions of American and NATO pilots against, direct quote, an almost equal opponent will be practiced there. By this same almost equal opponent, Western journalists understand, well, so they immediately wrote, Russia, and, as it was also said, the growing challenges from China. At the same time, Alaska is presented as a kind of springboard for the projection of power in the North, the most important line of defense of the United States in the Arctic. Well, of course, there's not much to be surprised about. Under a far-fetched pretext, countering the mythical threats from the East, the United States and NATO continue to recklessly pursue a course of active militarization of the Arctic, expanding their military capabilities in the region and the scale of training operations, often of an offensive nature. Of course, such steps do not contribute at all to strengthening trust between the Arctic countries, undermine peace and stability in the North. Let me remind you that this is the same region that has long been considered a territory of mutually beneficial cooperation and dialogue. The Russian Federation has never threatened anyone in the Arctic and continues to be committed to finding political and diplomatic solutions to all emerging issues in the region. It will continue to take all necessary measures to protect our legitimate national interests in the high latitudes, to guarantee the security of our country on the northern borders, and also from aggressive. NATO Secretary-General Rutte made an extremely aggressive speech on the site of the London Institute of International Relations Chet House on June 9th. According to him, the alliance is working on creating a better version of NATO. As he said, what should an improved NATO be like? You probably think, well, more effective, or working for the benefit of the peoples of the countries that are part of this alliance, or having a specific goal setting for peace, building or maintaining peace. But no. As NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte said, NATO must become, direct quote, stronger and more deadly. It's just some, Koshai's confession, I think. The reason why NATO should make a quantum leap in its development, what do you think it is? Again, the reason is in Russia for Rutte. Allegedly, as he said, there is a threat coming from our country, which allegedly will not disappear even when the war in Ukraine, Raib said, ends. Why do all this? Yes, it is clear to intimidate and continue to intimidate the population in the member countries of the North Atlantic Bloc. It repeats absolutely such a twisted, recently promoted formulation of NATO strategists, that Russia may be ready, as they claim, to use military force against NATO in the next 5 years. Well, it's all a figure of speech. If you look at reality, Russia is already using military force against NATO in the form of repelling NATO threats that occur in the form of terrorist attacks by the Kiev regime. This is what the NATO Secretary General should have been talking about at all these conferences, telling how they turned their political henchmen in Ukraine into terrorists and extremists, how they unleashed a hybrid war against our country, and, in fact, are a threat to the security of the world majority. But no, they develop another song. In order to avoid the development of events invented by them, Brussels believes that this can be achieved only by a multiple increase in military capabilities, the capacity of the military-industrial complex, as well as defense spending. It is planned to expand the capabilities of air defense missile defense by 400%. Otherwise, as the NATO Secretary General said, direct quote, "You will have to learn Russian." Here I cannot but agree to start now. Only the motivation should be different. It's not clear at all what they are so afraid of teaching Russians. On the contrary, if we had got acquainted with the great Russian language earlier, it probably wouldn't have occurred to us to commit all the stupid things that we did. They wouldn't have to spend money to cancel us with the culture of our history, with the economy. They would not even have tried to play what they have already played. They would have had other thoughts. But you see, it's only now beginning to dawn on us that it is possible and necessary to learn Russian. This underlines that NATO remains at the same time with everything. This is despite the fact that NATO should, as he said, be stronger and more deadly, but still insists that it is a defensive alliance. When was the last time NATO defended against anyone? Just show me over the last decade at least. Okay, not a couple. Give me at least one example. How is all this possible at all if the North Atlantic Bloc is openly preparing for war and initiatively itself, and even with a clear indication of the future enemy? They came up with such another lie. Put it into their service. You can see for yourself that they are building up their potentials. There is no doubt that this is an aggressive bloc that acts to the detriment of the real interests of the inhabitants of the countries that are part of it. No one should have any doubts, or any attempts to convince themselves that this is not so. No, this bloc is aggressive, which still strives, according to its Secretary General, to become more deadly. Here's another because of the series The Horrors of Russophobia. The Finnish parliament in April approved a law prohibiting the purchase of real estate in Finland by citizens of states that, to quote directly, violate the territorial integrity, sovereignty and independence of other countries, pose a threat to the national security of Finland. A great slogan for real estate agencies, I think, in Finland, as well as a direct quote, "They can properly use their citizens to the detriment of Finland's security." Are they talking about us citizens, I hope? Are they talking about representatives of the NATO bloc? Are they talking about those citizens who live in the member countries of the North Atlantic Alliance when they say that the countries or citizens of those countries that violate the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence of other countries? They have neighbors on the European continent called the country Serbia. Maybe the Finnish parliament will raise the story of 20 years ago, who bombed Belgrade, and how. Have you heard anything about Iraq? Do you know about what was done to Libya and who did it to her? This prohibition also applies to legal entities that are registered in such states or controlled by their citizens, despite the clumsy, veiled wording of the Finnish legislators. Is that clear? And in the same way, the public has read in these, or between these lines, who it is about, and which country is recognized by the official Helsinki as again the main threat to Finland. As if there is no intrigue here, everyone understands that it was originally supposed to do something another Russophobic. But now, with the publication by the Finnish government of the corresponding list of states subject to this law, everything has finally become clear. Along with Russians, restrictions are also imposed on citizens of Belarus. I'm sorry, who has Belarus attacked in recent decades? Just wondering, I just want to know the list of victims. I have a big doubt in general whether the Finnish parliament is aware of where which side is located. But we could still, since the government is making a decision in Finland on the basis of this very bill, to ask. The Finnish authorities argue for such a decision by saying that a direct quote, "Just don't laugh. Minsk has a firm interest in acting in the interests of Russia, although there is no independent desire to undermine Finland's national security." That's how it's twisted. Fantastic. About 20,000 Russian citizens and several hundred Belarusians who live in Finland on temporary residence permits will lose the right to purchase real estate. To whom does the government and the Parliament of Finland make it worse? First of all, probably in their own country, having completely submitted to the seemingly obsolete Russophobic fear, in their irrepressible desire to isolate themselves from Russia in all possible ways. Although we are natural neighbors, Helsinki makes decisions that not only contradict international norms in the field of human rights, well, for example, the unilateral closure of the Russian-Finnish border, but in this case, it also represents an outright segregation on a national basis. How's that? If Russian, Belarusian. So you can strike in the rights. World history has already seen all this, including on the territory of Finland. It was barely possible for the Finns to dissociate themselves from the horror that could overtake them if they turned into a Nazi state. That's it. The world has already passed. And this part of the European continent is also from militant nationalism to Nazism. We know from the example of the history of that very Western Europe and Northern Europe just one step. And I think there is at least someone left in Helsinki who remembers it. But look, against the background of these trends, there are others that are already breaking out. In the face of unprecedented pressure from the Brussels bureaucracy, it is possible to maintain commitment to national sovereignty, respect for the will of one's own people. And it's not just possible, it's being implemented. And this is proved by the recent example of the Slovak Republic. In recent months, a significant part of Slovak society has expressed disagreement with the policy and anti-Russian sanctions imposed on this side by the European Union. The most obvious manifestation of this was the collection of about 400,000, almost 500,000, but let's be precise, 400,000 signatures of Slovak citizens for holding a referendum on the rejection of restrictive measures against the Russian Federation, because they cause significant damage to the economy of Slovakia, business, and the standard of living of the population of this country. Taking into account the population of Slovakia, this indicates a large-scale public support for this initiative. Slovak parliamentarians also did not stay away from the mood of their voters. The other day, the National Council of the Slovak Republic adopted a resolution that instructs the government of the country to take a position against the introduction of new anti-Russian sanctions at the level of the European Union. We agree that the actions of Slovak politicians reflect their desire to protect and defend national interests in the future and ensure the well-being of citizens. Democracy in the European Union. Well, at least it is declared, so be kind to listen to your people, most of the people. But this majority of the people does not even have the right to vote. Why? Because they are not asked, and when they try to tell them, they are immediately told that all this is inappropriate. It is obvious that the sanctions policy of the European Union, initiated under pressure from individual NATO member states, causes serious damage not to Russia, but to the countries of the European Union themselves. According to experts, the direct losses of European business from the sanctions pressure have already exceeded 1.3 billion euros. Unfortunately, against the background of a legitimate political discussion based on democratic mechanisms. The European Commission continues to adhere to a confrontational course. The other day, it was announced that the preparation of the next, you will not believe it, the 18th package of sanctions measures against our country. Where is the depth of democratic procedures? Where is she? In what? On what basis are all these sanctions, all these measures being prepared? Is this a request of the peoples? Who? From which countries? Were there any procedures followed? Or is it an ideological attitude? Of course, the second one, and all this testifies to the inability of the Brussels bureaucracy to hear the voice of the European peoples. This indicates a growing shortage of genuine democracy within the European Union itself. Of course, there is no doubt that sooner or later a rational, pragmatic approach will prevail in other EU countries as well, and the rejection of the destructive, illegitimate policy of sanctions pressure and the restoration of dialogue can contribute to the beginning of a discussion on ensuring sustainable security on the European continent. On the 17th of June, a meeting of the World Coordinating Council of Russian Compatriots will be held in Moscow at the Victory Museum with the participation of representatives of the Government Commission for Compatriots Abroad. During the meeting, the participants will discuss the implementation of a set of events that are accustomed to the 80th anniversary of victory in the Great Patriotic War, the issue of preserving historical memory, countering the falsification of history, including the concept of holding a world-themed conference of Russian compatriots. Let me remind you, it will be held in Moscow on the 29th-30th of October this year. Special attention will be paid to human rights issues, patriotic education of young people, support of the Russian language, promotion of Russian culture, the results of regional conferences of compatriots from Asia, Europe, and North America. Within the framework of the meeting, it is planned to consider reports on the work of thematic commissions of the World Coordinating Council of Russian Compatriots. And of course, there will be a flower-laying ceremony in the Hall of Memory and Sorrow of the Victory Museum. But our compatriots are being subjected to unthinkable pressure now. A provocative campaign continues in the media of Western countries against a Russian non-governmental non-profit organization, a purely human rights structure of the Foundation for the Support and Protection of the Rights of Compatriots Living Abroad. Let me remind you that this mechanism of legal assistance to our foreign diaspora was established by the Russian Foreign Ministry, Rosatrudnichestvo, in the 2011 year. We are talking about a tool to assist our compatriots who provide legal, advisory, advocacy, and, if necessary, humanitarian assistance in cases when they face difficult life circumstances for various reasons. Today, we have published a detailed statement from the Anti-Fund which refutes fakes and insinuations regarding its activities. A link to this document will be necessarily placed in the text of today's briefing. For the third year in a row, the Fund for the Support and Protection of the Rights of Compatriots Abroad does not allow you to sleep peacefully behind the taken Russophobe. Let me remind you, this is the very organization that really helps people without taking into account their ethnicity, nationality, those people who do not defend their legal rights in a foreign country. Now, this human rights organization, in the true sense of the word, is being subjected to terrible slander, outright misinformation, under the guise of a so-called formulated journalistic investigation. A group of European media has launched a large-scale provocation in order to distort the goals of the Foundation, to discredit this noble mission. And of course, the time for this was not chosen by chance. The leadership of some European countries, obsessed with saving the Nazi regime, is feverishly looking for something else to annoy in our country. Now they have reached our compatriots once again, not for the first time, but once again. I would say not so much about compatriots, but how much about the help they receive. Sometimes I find myself in an absolutely hopeless situation because of harassment, largely because of the harassment that is being unleashed specifically against them in Western European countries. Up to millions of those who, despite the pressure, support their homeland, their country, their fatherland. The objectives of the special military operation on demilitarization, denazification of Ukraine, after all, they are truly hunted, and they want to intimidate, punish, just beat them somewhere or influence them in some way. This is a real cave Russophobia in action. The goal of this whole smelly company is obvious: to compromise the fund, squeeze it out of Europe, intimidate its partners. The most important thing is to simply force compatriots to abandon their connection with the motherland, not by washing, but by rolling. I would like to repeat once again, the Foundation does not cooperate and has not cooperated with the special services. There are no representatives of them, as Western media serve here, among the employees, and there were none. All the statements of the Western media, and to the contrary, is a gross lie, a provocation written on the basis of old methods from the Cold War. Let me remind you that most of the accusations boil down to a banal and already worn-out thesis about his cooperation, as they write there, with the Russian special services in the interests of conducting an influence operation on the territory of a European Union country. The basis of these so-called investigations, in addition to clearly distorted, publicly available public information, is the hacking of the Foundation's email. The materials stolen either by hackers or just by Western special services are presented as a kind of leak. What kind of leak? Hacked on purpose. What can I say here? This is your civilized world, looking for hackers. Here, find it in your environment. I would like to emphasize once again that the main purpose of the Foundation's activities, as stipulated in its charter, and the regulatory legal documents of the Russian Federation regulating its functions, is to assist compatriots living abroad, to ensure their human rights and freedoms, the very ones that the West has been constantly talking about over the past decades. Assistance in defending legitimate interests. Our efforts, in fact, are aimed at creating the necessary conditions for the non-discriminatory existence of compatriots in their countries of residence, of which they should be considered an integral part, since they make a real contribution to the economic, cultural, social development and prosperity of these countries with their work and intelligence. We will continue to be guided by the principles of international human rights law and, on their basis, provide legal assistance and support to compatriots in need. There were many questions about the situation between Iran and Israel. We see frequent media reports of increased tension between the two countries, including speculation about possible attacks on Iran's nuclear power facilities. Well, you don't need to be a military expert to understand the perniciousness of such an adventure, fraught with far-reaching humanitarian, radiological, traditional consequences for the region. In the 24th year, against the background of the ongoing escalation in the Gaza Strip of Iran, the Israeli confrontation was already escalating. Then Tehran and West Jerusalem carried out a series of mutual missile strikes. Then the region managed to keep from sliding into the abyss of a big war. However, the bellicose rhetoric is not abating even now. For our part, we are convinced that military methods will not help to achieve a settlement of the existing contradictions. In this regard, in contacts with all parties involved, we have called and are calling for refraining from steps that will lead to a further increase in violence and possibly a way out of the situation out of control. We count on the effectiveness of the ongoing indirect dialogue between Iran and the United States. As far as we know, the next round of Iran-US consultations may take place in the near future. We proceed from the fact that only diplomacy can offer a mutually acceptable, viable solution based on international law and a balanced balance of interests, and Russia confirms its readiness to make a feasible contribution to the negotiation process. On the 15th of June, the sponsor of the 15 years of the ASEAN Center at MGIMO of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia. Our relations with ASEAN are among the Russian foreign policy priorities. For more than 3 decades, they have acquired a truly comprehensive character, which covers interaction in the fields of politics, security, economic and cultural spheres. The Rosian Center has become one of the key tools for promoting cooperation with the association and its member countries of Southeast Asia in the humanitarian, educational fields, and the development of ties between business and academic circles. In the 23rd year, On his initiative, MIMO launched a 2-year master's program for specialists from Russia and the ASEAN 10 countries. The center allows expanding channels of interaction with partners, including through the capabilities of the ASEAN network of research centers in Russia, the so-called second track of the ASEAN Regional Security Forum of the Asia-Pacific Security Cooperation Council. His effective work receives well-deserved recognition in the countries of the region. I would like to congratulate the management and staff of the center, each of whom is a true professional, enthusiasm for their work. Congratulate them on their anniversary, wish creative inspiration, success, and, of course, new interesting initiatives, as all this is important now in the conditions of such global turbulence. On the 11th-12th of June in Kazan, literally these days, the Third International Forum of Ministers of Education, Shaping the Future, is being held. The event is organized by the Ministry of Education of the Russian Federation, together with the Cabinet of Ministers of the Republic of Tatarstan, interested departments and organizations, with, of course, the assistance of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia. The goal is a form of coordination of efforts in the field of education, which is one of the most relevant areas for international humanitarian cooperation with friendly countries. And, of course, the demand for this work is evidenced by the participation of about 112 distinguished foreign guests from 33 countries. After all, the President of the Russian Federation sent an appeal to the guests of the forum. In it, he stressed that free, equal access to knowledge, technology, scientific achievements is one of the main factors of sustainable development, the formation of a just and secure multipolar world. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, in his video greeting to the participants of the event, emphasized Russia's focus on developing a mutually respectful partnership in the field of education, based on recognition of the cultural and civilizational diversity of the world. The forum delegates will exchange experiences, discuss issues of strengthening national education systems, as well as new training formats, advanced solutions for the training of teaching staff, the organization of effective interaction of educational organizations in the context of global digital transformation. And, of course, we are confident that the dialogue within the framework of the forum will be meaningful, and the recommendations developed as a result of it will be implemented in practice for the benefit of the citizens of our countries. Well, concluding the introductory part, I want to join the day of tomorrow in one way or another. On the 12th of June, a state holiday is celebrated in our country, the Day of Russia. A lot will be said by the country's leadership, public figures, and just by the citizens themselves. Celebrations on this day from Kamchatka to Kaliningrad will reflect all the diversity and unity of our great country. Concerts, exhibitions, sports competitions, and, in general, our favorite folk festivals will create an atmosphere of a truly national celebration. Large cities will prepare large-scale events, small settlements will prepare warm native Russian festivities. Well, by the word native Russian, we mean our common Russian, multinational, multi-conference. Everywhere, there will be something with its own characteristics, with its own traditions. It is significant that for the third time on the Day of Russia, residents of, as we say, new, actually historical subjects of the Russian Federation, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, the Zaporozhye and Kherson regions, also meet. Our soldiers, heroes of a special military operation, will celebrate this day with a special feeling. These are traditionally festive events, of course, will be held abroad, in Russian diplomatic missions, on the platforms of international organizations, where our representatives consistently and firmly defend the national interests of our country, and, of course, we are always joined by true friends, friends of Russia, those who sincerely share the commitment to a more just, polycentric world order, free from dictates and neo-colonial practices. We celebrate Russia Day with a sense of legitimate pride and joy, a celebration of a sovereign, independent state with a great past and looking to the future. A state with a powerful economic, scientific, intellectual potential, while maintaining the indissoluble connection of times, in fidelity to its origins, and spiritual and moral foundations. We will confidently overcome all the challenges and trials facing us and will inevitably achieve our goals. Happy New Year, Happy Russia Day. You know, they often ask in the context of that, too. Of course, we also have presidential decrees on spiritual and moral values. There are also cultural and humanitarian concepts. A lot of things are accepted. There is our storehouse, literally a storehouse of fiction, amazing films about what Russia, the motherland, the fatherland is. But every time, I suggest that everyone once again turn to our anthem. How amazing, mentally and factually clearly with what spirit, it describes what Russia and our people are. I am ready to answer your questions. Is the International Life magazine with us?
Hello, Maria Vladimirovna.
Hello.
Happy New Year.
Thank you, and you too.
The question we have is this. On the 4th of June, in an interview with the Financial Times, Moldovan Prime Minister Rikin said that Russia was allegedly interested in the victory of the Moldovan opposition in the upcoming parliamentary elections in the autumn, because this will enable Russia to deploy 10,000 Russian soldiers in Transnistria. How would you comment on this statement at all? And what is the overall situation of Pridnestrovian regulation?
You know, this is about 10,000 Russian soldiers. Accommodation. To be honest, I would like to clarify what sources the head of the Moldovan government was guided by when voicing this nonsense. Perhaps these are the consequences of the anti-Russian frenzy in which the current Moldovan leadership has been for a long time. But what does it rely on? Where did he get such data from? Where? How? Maybe it was hacked by hackers and rebooted. Now he's talking all this nonsense. Perhaps the content of his conversations with officials and parliamentarians from the European Union countries also had an impact on the Moldovan Prime Minister. Maybe they brought him this unseemly news. He's been here in Brussels these days. Maybe they showed him something and told him, then let him share where he got it all from. Maybe I dreamed it. I don't know. We need to clarify. Let's look at the facts. The number of Russian military personnel on the left bank of the Dniester, within both components of the contingent of peacekeeping forces in the security zone, with a clearly defined mandate, and as part of an operational group of Russian troops to perform tasks to protect military equipment warehouses, is a multiple of the fantasy of the Prime Minister of Moldova to be 1,200 people. Their presence in the region directly depends on the Transnistrian conflict settlement process. The Russian military remains the only real factor guaranteeing peace and tranquility on the Dniester. I would like to inform the Prime Minister of Moldova there is no need to increase their number. Moreover, the threat to the region turned out to come from a completely different direction, bearing in mind the analytical material published recently in the Washington Post newspaper, which shows that the Kiev regime has plans to invade the left bank of the Dniester. As for the situation, and although I do not know, maybe the Prime Minister of Moldova, who obviously speaks Romanian, has already retrained for the interests of the Kiev regime and is not averse to becoming not only associated with Romania, but also with Ukraine, not a state. I don't know. They're all going to come up with that they don't have a Moldovan language. They are simply ready to give up their statehood for nothing. Maybe this is where all these fantasies lie. Now, as for the situation in the Transnistrian settlement process, unfortunately, it has not changed for the better. It is obvious that a direct dialogue between Chisinau and Tiraspol cannot replace the negotiation process in a multilateral format. Instead, attempts by the Moldovan side to exert economic pressure on Transnistria continue. We are convinced that they are ineffective and bring the settlement process to a standstill. Against this background, the pause in the work of the 5+2 multilateral negotiation format, in which our country is the mediator and guarantor, has been unreasonably prolonged. We believe that this is the only internationally proven platform that can and should still contribute to solving topical issues of the Transnistrian settlement. We are told about the possibility of seating at the table. I mean, we are told that it is impossible to seat Russia and Ukraine at the same table. It turns out an amazing thing. It is possible to hold 2 rounds of direct negotiations in Istanbul, and it is also strange to hear all this at the meetings of the Joint Control Commission, the governing multilateral body of the peacekeeping operation in Transnistria. Can't I? Why can't 5+2 be spent? In Istanbul, you can. Why is it possible at the meetings of the Joint Control Commission? Why can't it be in a different format? These are specific questions. There is no need to fantasize. Here it is necessary to ask them, to these very people, who are making similar statements, from the current official Chisinau. Russia's position regarding the solution of the Transnistrian problem remains unchanged. We see our mission in this process, primarily in maintaining peace and predictability on the left bank of the Dniester. We are in favor of normalizing the dialogue between Chisinau and Tiraspol, compliance with previously reached agreements, something like this. But in general, I want to hear from where and how and why the Prime Minister of Moldova operates with these figures. Who suggested them to him? False.
Thank you very much. And on the same subject, I mean the Moldovan one, the question is, the Moldovan authorities are now continuing to implement measures aimed at terminating the Russian-Moldovan Agreement of 98th year on cultural centers. Well, in other words, its denunciation will mean the closure of the Russian Center for Cultural Science in Chisinau. How would you comment on the situation?
The actions of the Moldovan authorities to denounce the 98th agreement are, of course, part of the Sandu regime's anti-Russian Russophobic campaign aimed at destroying bilateral relations. All this is accompanied by endless fakes, false accusations against our country about some kind of interference in the internal affairs of Moldova, but we have just commented on this with you on a specific example. Russian House or the Russian House is now declared a source. You just have to imagine misinformation. They accused him of promoting subversive activities. What kind of irrepressible nonsense is this? However, the absurdity of such fabrications is obvious. The Russian Center of Science and Culture in Chisinau, as in other capitals, implements projects exclusively humanitarian, educational orientation, promotes the development of cultural dialogue between the peoples of Russia and Moldova. Let's just focus on the aspect of why this very Russian House is so interfering with the Moldovan authorities. As the parliamentary elections scheduled for September 28th approached, the ruling regime in Chisinau decided to act absolutely according to a clearly worked-out scheme of using the thesis about, as they came up with, the Russian threat for the purpose of. For what purpose? To create some comfortable voting conditions for yourself, in order to throw in some argument in your favor, to take your eyes away from the socio-economic monstrous problems that Sandu has created for her people. Let's go over the facts. The 4th of June, the Moldovan Foreign Ministry announced that only Moldovans living in the USA, Canada, Scandinavian countries, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand will be given the opportunity to vote by mail in the upcoming elections. The Moldovan diaspora of many thousands in Russia will be deprived of this opportunity by Chisinau. Experts and political scientists unequivocally point out that in this way, the authorities create opportunities for mass fraud of the results of their statements. But the main thing is not even that. The fact that the fraud there is all stated. This is simply unacceptable. This is incompatible with democratic procedures. To cut off people, citizens who have the right to cast their vote according to these principles. It's not a technical impossibility. This is an unwillingness to give a voice to a segment of their own native society to express their will. What kind of democracy? Representatives of the Moldovan opposition predict that official Chisinau will do everything to minimize the number of polling stations in Russia in the upcoming elections. Let me remind you, I think you know this too, there were only 2 open elections for the Moldovan president in the 24th year. Both are at the Moldovan embassy in Moscow. As a result, Thousands of Moldovans who are in Russia were deprived of the opportunity to exercise their right to vote. Censorship in the mass media of Moldova is increasing. The powers of the Television and Radio Broadcasting Council, controlled by the authorities, are being expanded. A draft amendment to the Code on Audiovisual Media Services has been registered in the Moldovan parliament. It provides for large fines for disinformation, as it is written there, capable of damaging national security, democratic, political processes. Of course, this is a good formulation, but they still understand what it is aimed against. Here, please, is a fake that I have just commented on from the Prime Minister of Moldova regarding the fact that Russia wants to introduce contingents, increase them quantitatively, and so on. But after all, no one will impute any fine to him. And the agency that spread this misinformation, the Prime Minister of Moldova, will not be fined and will not be discharged. And why not? In fact, this is another tool for applying methods of influence to the authorities. Bloggers, journalists, public figures, politicians, candidates who will go to the polls. At the same time, the socio-economic situation in the Republic is rapidly deteriorating. According to independent experts, more than 80% of the inhabitants of this country cannot afford, well, for example, a healthy diet. 25% suffer from hunger in Moldova. This is a consequence of the decline in agricultural production and its exports. According to the results of the 24th year, it decreased by 12, as much as 0.2%, including in the EU countries by almost 10%. The total public debt of Moldova has reached almost $7 billion. A third of the budget expenditures are financed by Western grants and loans. Against this background, accusations against Russia, especially the Russian House, of interference in the internal affairs of Moldova look, I want to say, simply ridiculous. Moldovans don't believe it either. And how is it possible to believe it? What does the Russian House have to do with it? And what is happening in their agriculture? The Moldovan authorities' plans to close the Russian House are perceived painfully by the residents of the country, Russians. Last week, an initiative group of representatives of the Russian community of Moldova and the Coordinating Council of Russian Compatriots announced their intention to defend the Russian House. The determination and courage of Moldovans deserve more than just respect. I do not know. It seems to me that it is already worship, given what those who allegedly hide behind serving the Moldovan people are doing to the citizens of Moldova. So Lyria is with us.
Thank you very much.
Yes, if you have everything with us, Lyria News. Yes, Maria Vladimirovna. Hello, Christina. Hello. Let me ask you two questions today. The first question concerns the German authorities and the fact that these authorities continue to exert pressure on representatives of the Russian media. So, the head of the Russian peace mission in Berlin today, Mr. Feoktistov, was previously denied the right to continue working in the country and ordered to leave it no later than the 19th of August. At the same time, on the 6th of June, he was not released from the flight that arrived in the German capital. And later, the local police visited his family who remained in the country and confiscated the passports of his wife and daughter, allegedly out of fear that they might hide and not fulfill the signing, leave Germany before the 19th of August. How would you comment on this? First of all, we have already commented on this, but since you have asked this question, we will comment again on the fact that the German authorities have taken a political course to squeeze out Russia's media presence and its information space at any cost. We talk about this regularly. There are too many reasons for such comments coming from Germany in relation to almost every domestic mass media represented there. The methods are different. Then they block broadcasting. Then they grant accreditation. Then they literally have a forceful effect on journalists and their family members. Then they deploy a campaign of harassment. What the Union of Journalists in Germany, as it were, allows itself to do, headed by its head, is beyond the limits of not only journalistic ethics, but in principle universal morality. This time, family members, journalists, wife and daughter, whose passports were taken away from them, as if they were literally enslaved, became the object of pressure and just some kind of fanatical bullying. That's how documents were selected earlier, They are not allowed their father and husband, although before the departure date designated by the German authorities themselves. It is still more than 2 months. The attitude to ordinary people, even to a minor, to a 7-year-old girl, as notorious criminals who were put under house arrest. That's what it is. This is pressure. These are unacceptable methods of influencing a journalist and his family. And can I ask a question? But for what? There just has to be some reason. It should be called. But why does all this apply to them? For the fact that they did not have the caution to be in the so-called liberal Germany as family members of a Russian journalist. That's just the reason. Official Berlin is obliged to explain itself. Why are they being persecuted like this? Why are they being bullied so much? After all, it just seems to me that the next one will be an attempt to put some kind of inscription or some kind of icon on them in order to designate them and separate them from the rest of the German citizens. Well, some bright color will paint the icon and stick it on. There is experience of such labeling in Germany. We all remember this very well. All this speaks of the total degradation in this country, not only of democratic foundations, but of universal moral guidelines. This is how bandits from low-grade militants act. This is not how representatives of the country's authorities, who consider themselves civilized, do not act. There is a desire to literally, well, just harass a person and his family, to send an extremely clear signal to other correspondents, and in general, to all those who, for example, have their own point of view, have the courage to say what they consider necessary, to send this one, you know, a label, to send a signal what will happen to them. It's just a terrible trend. And against the background of Germany's economic failure, such thoughts, ideologies, methods of influencing people, they also took place in this synergy. We will definitely respond to such acts of cave Russophobia and political censorship. We've already talked about this, but relevant international structures, such as the UNESCO Director General, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, OSCE representatives on freedom of the media, and not only those who are engaged in ensuring freedom of expression, media pluralism, but also human rights defenders of a wide profile, are also obliged to respond to them. How they see the settling of accounts with journalists due to pressure on his family. What's next? So what's next? They have to have their say. I would like to point out that just by contrast, the German mass media in Russia and journalists and their families have always felt more than comfortable. You can ask these questions to them. You can do it under the camera, or you can do it in person. Another thing is that they can't open their mouths, because then they have to return to their Germany, which is suffering, obviously, from the coming liberal dictatorship. So this is all harassment of Russian journalists. This applies to both the RIA Novosti correspondent and the Channel 1 correspondents, who are practically poisoned in the same way, without being given the opportunity to extend their accreditation and visas. We will give an appropriate answer to all of this. Measures are being worked out and will follow in the near future. Thank you very much. If I may ask the second question. Yes, of course. President Donald Trump has expressed interest in the fact that the Russian side has facilitated the negotiation process between Washington and Tehran. Is Moscow ready to contribute to this process? Thank you. Well, I would like to say that the Russian side has not for a moment weakened its efforts in favor of a political and diplomatic settlement around the Iranian nuclear program. This was also discussed today perhaps in a slightly different context, and the mediated contacts between the United States and Iran that began in April gave some cautious hope that the situation could still be diverted from the dangerous line, excluding any force scenarios that are regularly voiced against the Islamic Republic. We also talked about this today. We proceed from the fact that Washington perfectly understands the ruinousness and inadmissibility of military strikes on Iran's nuclear energy infrastructure and deliberately chose diplomacy. As a matter of fact, Russia has repeatedly called for using the diplomatic, political, and diplomatic resource to the full, without hinting at some other options. Yes, it is obvious that there is a lot of difficult work ahead, which will require political will and endurance. We continue to be in close contact with our Iranian partners on this topic. The Americans also have a clear idea of our Russian approaches. Both Tehran and Washington are aware of Russia's readiness to provide the necessary assistance in working out certain aspects of the desired negotiated solution, which would eliminate suspicions and prejudices regarding Iran's peaceful nuclear program, while strictly observing the norms of international law. At one time, as you know, our country made a considerable contribution to the formation of a carefully calibrated balance of interests, on which the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action is based. It seems that even today, of course, the result of the indirect Iranian-American dialogue largely depends on the depth of the mood for rapprochement of positions and concrete steps towards each other, with due consideration, of course, of mutual requirements. The laws of Iran's right to develop the development of a peaceful atom, including the enrichment of uranium for civilian needs, are beyond doubt, and they are, in fact, enshrined in the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. We record Tehran's firm determination to continue discussing with the American counterparts the possible parameters of a potential agreement, which are based on voluntary countercommitments, and with a competent formulation of the case, and a stable constructive dynamics of further contacts, the sometimes off-scale level of confrontation will inevitably decline, and the achieved negotiation results will begin to be converted into practical progress, which could only be welcomed. And probably, summing up the line, with this rather broad approach to your main question, I can say that for our part, we fully intend to contribute to this in the interests of strengthening international peace and security. In short, we are ready. Thank you very much. Thank you. Leah Russia today is with us. Hello, Maria Vladimirovna. My name is Natalia, Artem TV channel. Maria Vladimirovna, in one of the latest articles, the Alpay publication writes about residential buildings that the APU has converted into workshops for drones. These residential buildings are located on the frontline territory. It also follows from the article that it is impossible to understand what is happening in these residential buildings, but their number is constantly growing. How much more evidence do you think is needed that the APU is hiding behind civilian infrastructure in order for their Western curators to finally put pressure on them? And how can this affect? How can such tactics of the armed forces of Ukraine affect Russia's positions on the negotiation process? Remember what we called such tactics. This is even a tactic that we formulated not with phrases. The Kiev regime is hiding behind civilian infrastructure. We were talking about human shield tactics. It's not just the civilian infrastructure, where the Kiev regime militants are hiding, and then they pass it off as allegedly Russian strikes on peaceful infrastructure. It's just using living people. Therefore, please do not reduce it all to walls, stone, roofs, windows, objects themselves. Talk about people. They don't feel sorry for people. They are not hiding in empty houses abandoned by the population. They also have guns not on deserted park grounds or children's facilities. They do all this where people live, where they walk, where they are treated, where they educate and educate their children. Therefore, this is a human shield tactic. Moreover, I will remind you of U International, which can no longer be suspected of any sympathies or playing along with the Russian side. She wrote about this and gave confirmation that warehouses for storing weapons, placing heavy weapons and air defense equipment, are being arranged in various non-military premises. This is also being done in elderly neighborhoods. The positions of the APU are being equipped in various social institutions, schools, hospitals. They have all been writing about this for a long time. This is another material, not the only one. But you ask how long, and how much more will it take? This material, like others, reflects gradually changing perceptions of the Ukrainian crisis. Until recently in the West, despite all our factual calculations, stubbornly turned a blind eye to the barbaric methods of warfare on the part of the armed forces of Ukraine. Let me remind you that the use of civilians as human shields is a gross violation of international humanitarian law. How else can we qualify the arrangement of the production of unmanned aerial vehicles for the needs of the army? Where? In residential buildings. No way. The more often and more people write about it and say their own things with their own names, the stronger the public response will be, I think. And how many jobs will be needed here is difficult for me to say. It seems to me that we should not count, but we should just take it and do it. And then I would like to hope that it will really begin to become such a universally recognized fact. Not just individual news, but a universally recognized fact that is necessary for the Western community to wake up. I mean those who still doubt something. We are also tracking all these facts, and we are also citing them. This becomes, among other things, food and a factual database for journalists who use these materials. At the same time, our approach to the settlement of the Ukrainian crisis remains unchanged. Russia is seriously determined to continue the negotiation process in order to reach some agreements. But I say again, all the parameters of these negotiation processes have been outlined by the Russian leadership. Therefore, I ask you to issue these phrases, if you quote, in the context of those previously designated negotiating approaches that were formulated by the Russian leadership. Thank you very much. Happy New Year. Thank you too. Is the Media Corporation of China with us?
Yes, Maria Vladimirovna, good afternoon. On the 10th of June, we celebrated the first International Day of Dialogue Among Civilizations. This initiative was put forward by China and unanimously adopted by consensus. At the 78th session of the UN General Assembly last year, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres stressed in his message that dialogue is the path to peace, and the affirmation of the diversity of civilization is more relevant than ever before. So, against the background of the current global challenges, how do you assess the key role, and, in general, the urgent need for a dialogue of civilization in strengthening global peace and development?
We rate it very highly both within the framework of the specialized bodies that exist and within the framework of efforts. It is called in different ways, people's or public diplomacy, when people unite themselves or hold events in order to prevent this very aggression, which we talked about today, from dominating a lot. It seems to me that this is one of the most important parts, and we often talk about it, of the coming multipolar world, when the state ceases to be passive objects of geopolitics and strives to strengthen national sovereignty, preserve identity, and leave a historical cultural heritage. To do this not aggressively, but through cooperation. Probably, this is how I would answer your question, but we can even send you more detailed material individually as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is Reuters with us?
Maria Vladimirovna, good afternoon. We are with you if you allow. We will have two questions. The topic of the first question appeared in one way or another during the briefing today. But if we look a little from the other side, does Russia see the risks for the negotiation process around Ukraine from the latest escalation of the conflict? Here are the strikes you mentioned on the Russian infrastructure and the statements of politicians from NATO countries about those 400% extensions of the air defense the Russian threat.
I think there is a contradiction in your question, because it's either risks or escalation. When you talk about escalation,
Risks from escalation. Risks to the negotiation process from the escalation of the conflict.
Right. I think it's either risks or escalation. Because if we are talking about escalation, then it is no longer necessary to talk about risks, but a direct threat to the political and diplomatic process. If we are talking about an escalation of the conflict, it's not about risks anymore. It's about the threat that needs to be talked about. Risks are when there may or may not be. Therefore, it seems to me that you are understating. You see, having assumed a key role in providing military and financial assistance to the Kiev regime, the Zelensky regime, the Western European Party of War. This is exactly how they position themselves. They continue to demonstrate an aggressive attitude, as you correctly said, to escalate. Not for some, I don't know, passage between Scylla and Charybdis, but they are betting on the continuation of the conflict, and its conclusions even, probably on other scales. They don't hide it, and means, and geography, and supplies, and its own militarization. And in this sense, to show the results of the regular meeting of the same Rammstein, held a week ago, which we discussed today. Did anyone there talk about peace or negotiations? No, of course not. Therefore, this is not about risks. It is about a direct threat, not only to the negotiation process, but also to the peace on the European continent as a whole. They understand, and also, maybe not directly, but they discuss it behind the scenes, and indirectly make it clear that peace agreements, from their point of view, will lead to the collapse of the neo-Nazi Kiev regime, and that it doesn't suit them. They practically declare it that way. They are afraid of this, and are ready to do anything to prevent such a scenario. But why, and why is, of course, a question for them. Whether it's a reluctance to appear, not even a desire not to appear, or maybe it's a fear of looking different from what they tried to present themselves as the rulers of the world. Maybe it has something else to do with it, but this, I think, is a question for political scientists. Therefore, I would still talk about a large-scale threat, not about risks.
Thank you very much. Just last night, Russian and US Ambassador Alexander Darchev said that Russia and the US had made a preliminary decision to postpone negotiations on restoring relations between them to Moscow and Washington from Istanbul, that the next meeting will be held in Moscow in the very near future. I wanted to clarify, maybe it is already known when exactly this meeting will take place.
You know, he said we would definitely let you know. Therefore, as soon as there is a date and logistics, because there really were a lot of questions, we will definitely share it with you.
Thank you very much.
Whether International Reports is with us.
Hello, Maria Vladimirovna. Andrea Luidi, international reporter. My question is in Italy, in the city of Bologna. Yuri Privatelli, an Italian fighting for the Ukrainian army, who had neo-fascist views in the past, will soon speak at the City Cultural Center. At the same time, the Bologna authorities closed another center, Villa Paradiso, for allegedly holding pro-Russian events there. How can you comment on this fact?
It's terrible. It's just a shame, because the decision of the authorities in Bologna to evict the cultural center of Villa Paradise from the historical premises in January of the 25th year, under the pretext of the decision of its leadership to hold a screening of a Russian film there, one of the most egregious examples, is the trampling of fundamental democratic values and freedom in Italy. Of course, the violation of the principle of freedom of speech, which is enshrined in international rights and documents, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the European Convention for the Protection of Human Rights, fundamental freedoms, is something that the Italian leadership constantly declares as its priority. It's no secret that the authorities of most Western European countries block their own citizens' access to alternative objective, sometimes out of the mainstream information. But we must remember that, first of all, censorship is prohibited in many of these countries. Secondly, it is not a concern for citizens, but a rigid instrument of control and, so to speak, a forerunner of the dictatorship, which is also familiar to the countries of Western Europe. The inhabitants of the European Union are increasingly finding themselves in such a digital information concentration camp, where the space of freedom narrows down to theses that were approved not even in their own governments, but somewhere there in collective Brussels, and lowered through the institutions of NATO, the EU or the European Commission for execution, to the capitals of seemingly sovereign states. This is no longer just a question of violating the basic right for Europeans to know more than the authorities allow. This is something else, but it seems to me that including Italians and their desire to understand, it is really strong. They want to know, they come to Russia, they write books, they do interviews, they follow the course of events. They are not afraid of the prohibitions of local authorities. They are not even afraid of threats from this crazy Bandera asset. Italy became the first member country of the European Union and NATO, where the Orthodox Documentary Film Festival was held on the 31st of May this year, the time of our heroes. Let me remind you that the purpose of this festival is objective coverage of a special military operation. The audience was shown different documentaries, but all about what is really going on there in the region, on the front line. These are the stories of real people, not made-up stories, not made-up people. This is not a fantasy. These are real facts. And this became possible thanks to the courage and caring of Italian citizens. And I would like to express special gratitude to the representatives of the Cultural Center in Gorica, the Cultural House, to the Italian journalist, public figure Vencio La Russa, who are really modern anti-fascists who share universal values, and are ready to fight neo-Nazism, thanks to his efforts in particular. In the 24th year, more than 100 screenings of Arti's films took place in 40 cities, in various cities of Italy. These are not feature films, they are not fiction, they are not cartoons, they are documentaries. At the same time, the festival has become the object of course, once again attacks from the European Parliament, Italian parliamentarians, mainstream media. It's interesting, isn't it? For some reason, it is impossible to show the brutality of the Bandera Nazis in Ukraine, because, as they explain to us, this is a manifestation of allegedly Russian propaganda. It has a strong influence on public opinion. These are facts. It's the truth. But the tours of an Italian mercenary who took part in the fighting in Ukraine on the side of the Ukrainian armed forces, including his performances in the building, are strongly encouraged and even supported by the parliamentary parties, and they are unceremoniously expelled from there. I mean, the cultural center was expelled for this. Is this the first Italian mercenary who is used for such purposes and admits his crimes with impunity? No. And despite the fact that the actions of the Italian participant in the fighting in Ukraine, on the side of the armed forces of Ukraine, did not receive a legal assessment. And this, remember, was Julia Schiff. She spoke at pro-Ukrainian rallies in Italy, openly declared her service in the ranks of the armed forces of Ukraine, and confessed to her personal participation in the murders of Russian servicemen. No one in parliament, in particular, paid attention to this. Not only in the Italian parliament, law enforcement agencies and the Italian government should take a closer look at this. Therefore, yes, we state that the vivid and unprincipled manifestation of double standards demonstrates the true motives and true essence of those who, serving a political order, continue to ban Russian public cultural and educational events under far-fetched pretexts.
Thank you very much.
So, is Open TV Greece with us?
Yes, Maria Vladimirovna, if I may, there are also two questions.
Yes, of course.
Recently, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs announced that it had banned entry to a Greek official. In response to the refusal to extend accreditation to a RIA Novosti correspondent in Greece. You haven't mentioned his name yet. You won't call at least.
There are rules by which we do not call a name. There are countries for which the names of those and the positions of those who fall under Russian sanctions are called. We do not have such a practice in relation to you countries.
If I may have one more question. Recently, it has been written in the Greek media that Greece is sending military aircraft and accompanying personnel to Romania. Do you have any information about such NATO plans in the region? Someone says that maybe the time is approaching for the announcement of the so-called unmanned zone on the territory of Ukraine or around it. What is your assessment of such plans, such actions?
We have repeatedly noted that NATO uses, first of all, these hyped false pretexts about the alleged Russian threat to continue its expansion and aggressive activity. The NATO presence on the eastern flank is increasing. The Black Sea region is no exception in this sense. Coalition tactical combat groups are stationed there, and all new projects are being implemented to expand the military infrastructure of the NATO bloc. The alliance's aviation component is actively involved in patrolling the airspace over the Black Sea water area. All these actions, steps, and expansion are obvious. It is certainly monitored by our relevant structures. I would like to emphasize once again that the concentration of NATO's military potential in the region is unjustified and leads only to further escalation of the military-political situation. If you have any more detailed questions, we will be happy to work with experts on them.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lee News is with us. RU.
Hello, Maria Vladimirovna.
Yes, hello.
Addition of less than Earl greater than Mikhail Rosen. We congratulate you on the upcoming holiday.
It's mutual with you too.
Thank you. We have two questions. Russian Foreign Ministry's position regarding the next attempt of the Latvian Seimas at the legislative level to prohibit the communication of Russian people in Russian in public and public places in Latvia.
It's a shame, a terrible shame, for a country that considers itself civilized. I am not sure that the authorities and the current regime of Latvia can generally be characterized as civilized in this way. But what they are doing is a real shame for the people of this country. Latvia is one of the EU countries where the Russian-speaking population is subjected to the most extensive discrimination. Riga continues to implement the policy of building a monoethnic model of the state, ignoring all key documents in the field of human rights protection, including, first of all, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Convention on the Protection of Human Rights, Fundamental Freedoms, as well as numerous OSCE commitments in this area. This is the real Nazism as it is. Neo-Nazism, hybrid Nazism, whatever you want to call it. It is it that manifests itself in this way. We regularly draw the attention of the general public to this egregious situation, including at all relevant international venues. Riga always hides behind the backs of its senior patrons in the European Union. We are convinced that Europeans cannot fail to understand how much the policy of the Latvian authorities contradicts the notorious values of democracy, which Brussels so zealously defends. However, now lately it is not as zealous as before, because it became inconvenient to enter the clinch, to admit that Riga acts simply in the discourse of neo-Nazism, to sign its own complicity. It turns out, the forbidden use of any language on its territory is a real disgrace for any state governed by the rule of law, especially if we are talking about a language that is native to a significant part of the population. How strong should such things as the irrational fear of official Riga, of the mythical threat from Russia, which they themselves have invented, or Brussels for them, fear, hatred of his Russian, including language and culture, be, in order to fight them with such barbaric or even more than barbaric methods? We are not going to put up with this with everything. We will continue to resist Latvia's illegal actions against our compatriots, to seek from Riga compliance with international obligations in the field of human rights, for actions for these purposes, with all the levers at our disposal.
Thank you, and if I may, the second question. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban said that Russians understand only the language of strength, and Europe is now in a weak position. He also believes that the people of Hungary do not want to die for Ukraine, do not want it to turn into a second Afghanistan, and demand that politicians take control of the situation in the neighboring country from the military. How can Smolenskaya Square comment on such theses of Mr. Orban?
You know, I have to look at the quote because I need to understand what it was about. Therefore, at this stage, I cannot comment on the first part to you. With the second part, regarding the fact that citizens and residents of Hungary do not want to die from Ukraine. So no one in the European Union wants this. That is why they are forcing the Kiev regime to carry out a violent mobilization in Ukraine, already affecting even school children. Well, 18 years. What is it? This is just a schoolboy, a student. This is a young man. This is the first thing. Secondly, you know, we have known Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban for many years as a principled politician who firmly defends Hungarian national interests, who is not afraid to defend his point of view, despite the constant pressure exerted on him in Brussels. He is known for his balanced attitude and approach to the situation in Ukraine, a deep understanding of the root causes of the situation, the conflict, as well as the results of Zelensky's lack of independence, which is completely controlled from the outside. This is what he said, stated not just repeatedly, literally constantly, calling on many EU officials, bureaucrats, leaders, to take a responsible look at this situation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you with us, Liverek.
Good afternoon, Maria Vladimirovna.
Good afternoon.
Happy New Year to you. I have 3 questions today. Here's the first question. Recently, in Azerbaijan, according to the NATO cooperation program, trainings were held during the operation planning process, during which theoretical and practical tasks for planning NATO operations management and other topics were planned. The next military exercises of Azerbaijan with one of the leading NATO members, Turkey, will be held soon. In this network, I would like to know how you would comment on such active cooperation between Azerbaijan and NATO, and how this cooperation can affect stability and security in the region.
We have repeatedly said that NATO does not bring anything good for the security of the young Caucasus. On the contrary, the main goal, as we well understand, of Westerners is to shake up the region, to set it off, to create new points of tension. We hope that both Baku and Yerevan equally understand our well-founded concern about this, and fully assess the risks of deepening their interaction with aggressive military blocs.
Recently, Azerbaijani President Hikmet Hajiyev, speaking about the negotiations with Armenia, noted that in his opinion, and in Baku's opinion, there is no need for the presence of foreign military forces stationed in the region, considering that it is only Russia that has armed forces in the region, in Gyumri, a base in Gyumri, in fact. This is a call for Armenia to withdraw the Russian military base from its territory. How would you comment?
Well, I think that's your interpretation. I've never heard that from his mouth. If you send me a quote where it says so, we will then comment on it in addition. On the contrary, we are aware of Baku's concerns, and rightly so, about the activities of the mission in Armenia. It is well known what the employees of this so-called mission are doing. They spy on neighboring Armenia and countries. Of course, they do not report to Yerevan. They do not contribute to any stability in the region. As for the Russian military base stationed in Armenia, we have not received any signals from Yerevan regarding its possible withdrawal. Officials of the Republic confirm, including publicly, that such issues are not on the agenda. Yerevan understands that the Russian military presence is an important element of the security architecture in the region, both in Armenia and throughout the South Caucasus. The location and operation of the base is regulated by the relevant bilateral documents between Armenia and Russia? This question, in my opinion, has never been raised by anyone in the context or in the plane of our interaction with Azerbaijan. Therefore, there is also no need to think about it here. And, by the way, in March of this year, we celebrated the 30th anniversary of the agreement on the Russian military base on the territory of the Republic of Armenia, on which I congratulate you all.
And here's the last question. Azerbaijan continues to destroy historical monuments in Nagorno-Karabakh, including monuments to the heroes of the Great Patriotic War. Recently, another monument to his swords was destroyed in the village. According to these facts, for example, even the Investigative Committee of Russia appealed to the Union of Armenians in Russia. I would like to know your opinion. Have you finally received some kind of answer from Baku? Why they are destroying the monument to the heroes of the Great Patriotic War?
We are working with our Azerbaijani colleagues in this regard, I can assure you of that. But at the same time, I would like to ask you a question. Are you interested in other monuments that are being demolished in other countries? I have never heard or seen any materials on this subject. And, frankly speaking, I have never seen such massive assistance in our defense of memory, including Soviet soldiers, whose surnames clearly indicate their Armenian origin. We always do everything to defend their memory, lay flowers, maintain graves, do everything to protect them from desecration or restore them. Why, in this sense, you are never prompted to ask questions, and not only to us, but maybe even in your own country. What are the joint efforts in this regard? Now look at what was going on. And in Ukraine, were there no Red Army soldiers with Armenian roots, there when the bodies were exhumed, when the monuments were demolished? I haven't heard any of your questions, or any desire to talk about it. Why is that? Don't, please, I'm begging you. We perfectly understand why and in what context you raise this topic. That's the truth. I beg you very much, you don't have to do this. To some extent, this is becoming simply blasphemous. Ask me such questions. Ask them regularly. Well, really don't. Everything is clear. The next time you want to talk about monuments, let's do an interview with you. I'll tell you everything.
But I am a representative of Armenian.
I say again, representatives of the Red Army of Soviet soldiers, who are your compatriots, are exposed to their remains. Monuments with their names are regularly desecrated on the territory of the countries of the European Union. Where are you all? Where is your reaction? Where is the desire to defend these monuments? Only our country comes out and protects them in every possible way. What are you talking about? This topic is generally outside of your information space and management. Thank you very much. Let's move on. I'm sorry, but this is crossing the line. This is crossing the line. I say again, these are not acute issues. This is a simple topic. It's on the verge of blasphemy. Really, I will be happy to do a special interview with you on this subject. I'll give you the facts, I'll tell you everything, and maybe you will finally ask this question to someone from the other side, for example, from yours. Why in the monument, which are being demolished, which stand at the burial place, including Armenian soldiers, does not cause any interest in the public of your country at all? And why do other countries stand up for them? You have nothing to present to me, really. I am deeply engaged in this topic. Thank you very much. Let's move on. Belarus today. Is Belarus with us today? If not, is Alma Edin with us? Hello.
Happy New Year.
Thank you very much. Well, I understand that you are a citizen of another country, but thank you.
I am a citizen of Russia once again.
Oh, really? Well, then I congratulate you on the holiday too.
How do you assess the information that Israel has introduced an air defense system and weapons in Ukraine? We can say.
As you know, this statement was made by Ambassador Brodsky of Israel. This is not the first time he has made such statements. This time, it was commented on by the Israeli Foreign Ministry, which said that this information is not true. Why does the Israeli Foreign Ministry? In general, the Israeli state allows its ambassador, who is in official status, to make such statements. This is a question for them, but I say again, we have received an explanation from the Israeli Foreign Ministry that this statement does not correspond to reality. We are guided by the official assurances of the Israeli side that this state has not supplied and does not intend to supply weapons to Ukraine in the future. We are convinced that this approach meets the national interests of Russia and Israel, contributes to the preservation and development of the existing constructive bilateral cooperation in various areas, including those strategically important for both countries. Thank you. There is no Belarus today. I see that we still have a few questions left. I will allow you to answer them individually if you allow, given just the schedule. I congratulate everyone on the upcoming holiday. I wish peace, prosperity, and all the best to you and your loved ones. Happy New Russia Day.